Hey guys, so today I am going to show you all how to make your own watercolor coloring page. This is based off of activity books that I used to have as a kid that would come with a watercolor palette right on the paper. And what you would do is get a brush and some water, and then you could just dip your wet brush into the paint on the paper and then basically just paint with it into the coloring sheet that was there. I'm adding like a little bit of an extra cool thing about this project and adding a wax resist secret message that I think is pretty neat. So all we need are some basic materials. You'll need watercolor paper, pencil and eraser, just a normal number 2 pencil is perfectly fine. Permanent markers, they have to be alcohol based because those are going to be the outlines of our coloring page, and when we apply water to them to paint them, we want to make sure that they don't bleed with the paint. And then we're also going to need some wax-based crayons and some water-based markers. Okay, so let's get started. So for this project, I am going to make a picture of the night sky with a special surprise constellation. So to do that, I'm going to start off with my pencil, and I'm going to work really lightly. The first thing I'm going to think about is where do I want my paint palette for my finished product to be. Now usually I like the paint palette to be on the left side because I'm right-handed, and so it helps to be able to like dip my brush into the left side of the paper and bring it over to the right side of the paper if I'm painting. I was imagining that this would be a cool thing to do if you want to correspond with a friend that maybe you haven't seen in a while, want to send them a cool message. And so if you think about how your friend might use this project the best, maybe they're left-handed and they want to be able to use their brush in their left hand and pull from the right side of the paper to paint. That's just something to keep in mind. For this one, I am going to imagine that my paint palette is going to be on the left side of my paper. So I'm just going to, in my head, imagine about maybe 2.5 inches from the edge is going to be reserved for my paint palette. So I'm just going to make sure to not put any of my drawing there so I can put my paints there. And so to start off with my drawing, I'm going to use pencil and I'm going to be very light in my sketches. I'm just going to kind of plan out where things are going to be. In this picture, I'm going to have some trees on the sides, just to kind of frame it. Those are just to tell me where the trees are going to be. And then I'll also have a mountain. I've been hanging out at Mary's Peak quite a bit lately, so I'm inspired by the shape of that mountain. It's got a little bit of detail there. And then the secret part of my project, or the secret part of my painting, is going to be all in the sky. So what I'm going to do is have stars around that you can paint over, but then when you paint over it, a constellation will reveal itself. And so I'm just going to kind of plan out how that's going to be, and I'm going to use really, really light pencil because we're going to need to erase a lot of this. And we don't want it to show through, especially if it's a secret. You don't want to give the secret away. So I am just placing where my stars will go. Maybe picking a spot for my moon as well, right there. Very light pencil. And then my secret constellation is going to be a cat. I don't know if there are actually any cat constellations in the Northern Hemisphere, but I think there should be. So in my painting, there's going to be a cat constellation. So I make the little face of my cat, little eyes and nose. And this cat, like a lot of the cats I draw, is inspired by my cat Dinah. She's a bit round, so I'm going to put a little round body, some feet, keeping it really simple. Really doesn't have to be very complicated, and also being very light with that pencil. There's her tail. Okay. So that's my basic sketch. Now I'm going to go in with the same pencil and kind of fill in some details. So for this one, I really like to draw noble fir and Doug fir trees, and I have kind of my own way of doing that. So I'm just going to go in and add some details to my trees. This is my way of doing it. Do like these little swoopies. And I'll also add kind of like a cedar. Cedars have these like kind of droopy sides. Still being fairly light, but it's okay to be a little bit more detailed. This is the part of the coloring page that's going to be outlined in black. And so if I press a little harder, that's okay, because I'm going to go over it with my permanent markers anyway. The things that we want to make the secret part though, you got to really make sure that that is super light, because you're going to need to erase it and then go over it with white crayon before you're done. And sometimes this pencil can still be seen through white crayon if you press too hard and don't erase fully. All right, so then the next step here is going to be to outline my pencil drawing that I want to keep as my coloring part. I'm going to use my fine line Sharpie. You don't have to use Sharpie, but it does have to be alcohol based. If you use a water-based marker, then when you paint over it, it'll all kind of bleed together, and we want to avoid that. So I am going to just go over my trees, and since I sketched it, so I did the pencil underdrawing, I can just choose which of my pencil lines I want to keep as my final lines, and then anything that I don't want to keep, you know, maybe I don't want to keep these straight lines down the middle of my trees, I'll just leave them unlined by the marker, and then when I erase, they'll be gone. Of course, one thing to know about these markers, these Sharpies, is that they are permanent ink, and so you want to make sure that you are working on a surface that in case you accidentally mark around your paper or it bleeds through, which it really shouldn't on watercolor paper, that's from something else, but the marker shouldn't bleed through the watercolor paper. But just in case, you want to make sure that maybe you have something underneath. So I have a piece of Bristol here just to catch some of like the accidents that might either bleed through, or if I accidentally go off the page with my marker, I won't mark up my table. Okay, so then the last thing that I'll outline with black is the shape of Mary's Peak. And I'm going to add a few little details here using the stippling method. So stippling is little dots. The idea being that the closer the dots are together, the more shaded that part of your drawing will look. The more spread out the dots are, it'll look like there's texture, but not a lot of shading. And in these coloring pages, I always liked best the coloring pages that had, you know, not a whole ton of detail that it might be overwhelming, but just like a little bit of detail that it was more than just a few simple lines. And so what's cool about projects like these is that you can make them exactly the way you like them. And if you're giving it to a friend, it's sort of a nice way to express yourself, you know. One thing to kind of keep in mind if you're doing this is maybe think about where your light source is. So this is going to be a nighttime picture where the picture is mostly lit by the moon, which I kind of very lightly sketched in right here. So that's going to be the main light source. So when I'm thinking about adding details like shading with stippling, I want to make sure the area that's closest to the moon looks like it's the brightest. So that's going to have the least stipples there, and then the places that are further away will have the most. And that just kind of tells your brain that that's how light is flowing over this object. Okay, so before erasing my pencil underdrawing, I'm going to let all of that ink dry. I'm going to make sure it's totally dry because I don't want to accidentally smear my picture. And then we're going to move on to adding the waxed resist. So I really like this method. I think it creates just like a cool multimedia texture. Just a neat way to do. And using these Crayola crayons are perfectly fine. Rose Art's also fine, but they just have to be wax resist. You can also use things like oil pastels. That will work really well. Things that won't work are going to be other markers or chalk. Perhaps if you use like oil-based markers, that might be okay, but those are pretty stinky and they can also be kind of pricey. And so I really like to just keep it simple. Crayola wax-based markers, crayons, I mean. All right, and then to do that, I am gonna pull out, I'm really only gonna use a couple of these colors. I'm gonna use yellow and white. And you'll notice that my crayons are just like little stubs of crayons. And that is because of a reason that I'll get to here in a minute. But pretty confident that my ink now is dry on my sketch. So I'm just gonna go over with my eraser and erase all the pencil lines because I don't need them anymore. All right, so then to create the wax resist part, the secret part of the image, I am going to continue to keep my eraser out. I'm going to kind of work through the picture methodically. I'm going to use my eraser to erase the stars one at a time. And as I erase them, I'm going to go back over where they were with the yellow crayon. Now the thing about doing the wax resist method, it's really best if you can press really hard with your crayon, which is why my crayons are so short, because, you know, I'll get out a really nice new crayon from my box. It'll be sharpened and long, and then I'll start doing this thing where I'm pressing really hard with them and they pretty much break immediately, which is totally fine with me. It kind of makes them a little bit easier to wield, actually. If you're doing something like this, you can really press really hard. Okay, I'm also gonna do that moon. Do the moon in white. You also kind of want to be careful that as you're erasing, you're not erasing over your crayon, because it will kind of pick up a little bit of the erasing gunk, and it might change the look of your picture. So I'm going over where my moon was sketched in, erased it fully, and now I'm going over it in white. Now white is super tricky because you can't really see it on white paper. That's sort of the point. That's what makes it a secret picture. So to kind of get around that, sometimes you can pick it up, move it around, see where the white crayon is. Just kind of pressing hard. Okay, now to make the secret part of my picture, my constellation is going to be the secret part. So what I'm going to do is put in stars around my cat constellation, because that's what constellations are, of course. They're pictures that are kind of made up by connecting stars. And then I'm going to draw the connection of the stars in the cat shape in white. So I'm going to put the stars in as yellow, and then the constellation itself is white. So to do that, I am going to very carefully erase where I want my stars to go. So I'm going to put one on the ear, one on the cheek, and then before I go too far, I'm going to also erase the line between them. Draw that in with the white crayon. I tested out a few different materials to use for this project. And it really seems like wax crayons are best, even though they can be a little bit tough to work with. Just put one right there in the middle of his forehead. You could also try to experiment with wax-based colored pencils. Those might be a little bit easier to get some finer lines and details. You can see maybe a little bit where I haven't erased fully, you can still kind of see the lines. That's okay, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. But the less you can get of that, the more secret your secret painting is going to be. All right, so that is pretty nearly done. Next thing we have to do is add the paint palette that's going to be on the side of our drawing. So what I really like to do, especially if I'm going to give this to a friend, you know, and let them know like, hey, I made you a really special secret art card. I like to put the instructions for how to get that secret out of there on here. So I'm just going to write with my pencil. I write brush plus water. So we're going to make these squares off to the side here, that are going to be our paint palette, just like that. And that is where these water-based markers come in. Now in some cases I use all the markers and just kind of create like a full palette. Sometimes I like to pick and choose which colors I think will work well for this picture. It's just another way to sort of design it the way you like it, make it yours. And so I think for this one, a nighttime scene, I'm going to only use a few colors. I'm not going to use all of them. I'm going to use, maybe add the gray too. So we've got gray, black, pink, green, purple, and blue. So if you want, you can sketch out how your paint palette is going to work. Let's see, we've got 6 colors here. So maybe I want to make big old rectangle. Like that. And then to make 6 squares in my rectangle, cut it in half, cut each half in thirds, something like that. It doesn't have to be perfect. It being kind of wonky, I think, is a neat way to be unique, be individual, just be you. Okay, so then for this, I'm actually going to erase a little bit of what I just drew. So I don't have the pencil marks everywhere. And the pencil, graphites can sometimes, if you're drawn with it on paper, it can sometimes come up in the marker and be a little messy, so just want to get rid of that. Okay, so then to create the palette, the way I kind of like to do it is to arrange colors sort of light to dark, sort of, not really. So I'm going to go pink first, and I'm just going to draw directly onto my paper where that little paint palette is going to be. What I do is I make a square and then I go over it twice, making sure everything is filled in. And I leave a little bit of space between each color. Okay, and then what I like to do once I have all the colors out is I like to go back and just make sure that there's enough ink on the paper that my friend can have enough to paint with. And you can kind of tell when this paper, if you're using this specific kind of paper from Artist Loft, this watercolor paper, you can really tell when it's got enough paint on it because it starts to kind of slough off a little bit, get a little too wet just by the marker and by the pressing on it. So once you get there, it's probably enough. I just want to make sure it's not too little, so really get in there. Very, very last thing to do would be to, if you want to, totally optional, would be to go over the instructions with the Sharpie. And maybe to friend, love, Jen. Take over the pencil, just erase the pencil from my instructions here. All right, and there you have it. Totally complete, ready to be delivered. Super secret, very special, uniquely made watercolor secret art card. All right, so you can give this to somebody or you can play with it yourself. The way to reveal the secret and to kind of, you know, use the way it's been designed is you'll need a glass of water, paintbrush, and I really like to have a little bit of paper towel handy. All you gotta do is wet your paintbrush. I like to blot a little bit of the extra water off on the paper towel. And then go into whatever color you'd like and just start painting. So you pick up, you just rub your wet paintbrush onto the color you want to paint with, and then you can just bring your world to life. To reveal the secret message, all you have to do is pick up the color you want to do the sky in and just start going over it. I like a combination of colors, and your secret art reveals itself. It's so neat. It's very unique. There she is, a little kitty constellation. All right, so I hope you enjoyed. I hope you try it out. It's pretty simple, and you can do so many different things with it. All right. Be creative.